The water was just 36 degrees Fahrenheit, so cold it takes your breath away within seconds. On calm days, Lake Superior reflects the sky like glass. But on November 10, 1975, it roared like an ocean, swallowing one of the largest freighters to ever sail the Great Lakes, and every soul aboard her. In the days that followed, rescue teams combed the waters, planes flew low along wave-tossed paths, ships cruised carefully through the area where the SS Edmund Fitzgerald had last been seen. What they found were scattered pieces of wreckage, lifeboats shattered like toys, torn life jackets drifting aimlessly, hunks of twisted steel, but not a single body. Not one. At first, people assumed the remains would surface eventually. That's what usually happens. Drowned victims, tragically, tend to rise back after a few days, carried by gases released during decomposition. But here, days passed, then weeks, then years, and not a single crew member was ever found floating on the surface. The Edmund Fitzgerald had vanished into the depths, and so had its 29 men. All that was left was silence, and questions. Why had no bodies resurfaced? Why go to such astounding lengths to protect the wreck with government restrictions and million-dollar fines? What exactly did divers see down there that changed the tone of this tragedy forever? This isn't just about what vanished, it's about what remained, and what wasn't meant to be seen. The Fitzgerald wasn't just another ship. When it was launched in 1958, it was called Queen of the Lakes. At 729 feet long, it pushed the limits of what could legally pass through the St. Lawrence Seaway. Massive, sleek, and supremely engineered, it was a metal leviathan tasked with hauling thousands of tons of iron ore across one of the most unforgiving freshwater lakes in the world. For 17 years it journeyed back and forth without a serious incident. Reliable, swift, and commanded by seasoned captains like Ernest McSorley, a man who had weathered over 40 years of maritime storms, it was viewed as a mechanical marvel, a titan that had tamed the Great Lakes, until the night it didn't. The Fitzgerald's final voyage began in Superior, Wisconsin, carrying over 26,000 tons of taconite pellets, bound for Detroit. Another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, was traveling the same route nearby, and the two ships kept in communication as the weather worsened. Lake Superior is notorious for November storms. Local sailors know them as the Witches of November, a nickname that sounds folktale but feels deadly real for those who've spent their lives on these waters. What started as a manageable gale the day before transformed into a catastrophic event. Wind speeds approached hurricane force. Gusts surged to 86 miles per hour. Waves towered as high as 35 feet, rolling mountains of black water crashing down with relentless force. Captain McSorley's last radio message to the Anderson was chilling in its calm simplicity. "We are holding our own." Moments later, the Fitzgerald dropped off the radar, never to reappear. There was no distress signal, no calls for help, just silence. In that moment, the ship and all aboard were taken, swallowed, and more than just the vessel vanished. The possibility of closure went with it. The Coast Guard and the Navy began vigorous search operations immediately. But what they faced was not an ordinary rescue. The lake's mood had shifted again, its anger giving way to a haunting quiet. They found floating debris, rafts torn and violent in appearance. But there were no signs of evacuation, no lifeboats properly launched, no bodies adrift. A 729-foot ship carrying 29 men had seemingly imploded into nothing. Years passed and expeditions returned again and again. They found the ship, split in two on the lake bed 530 feet below the surface, still imposing even in its destruction. But the questions only deepened, because even then, with all the technology, no remains were found, until 1994. That year, a private expedition captured something that stunned the teams involved, and deeply disturbed the families of the crew. Near the broken bow of the ship, embedded in the cold sediment of the lake floor, they found something else, a figure. Clothed in the fragments of a life jacket, caped in silt, preserved not by time, but by the sheer cold and pressure of a lake that does not forgive. It confirmed what many had feared, that the crew had not been scattered, but entombed. And that changed everything. Certain places become sacred, not because of what they are, but because of what they hold. The Edmund Fitzgerald wreck is not merely a disaster site, it's a graveyard. That realization began to shape everything that came after. From laws to documentaries to final decisions about whether to disturb what lies below. One body may have been seen, many more likely remain. but none were recovered, not because they couldn't be, but because a final line had been drawn, between curiosity and respect, between technology and morality, between discovery and haunting peace. Their quote as a saying among those who live near Lake Superior: "The lake never gives up her dead." It's not just folklore, it's a chilling scientific reality. One of the reasons the bodies of the Edmund Fitzgerald's crew were never seen again. Unlike most bodies lost at sea or even in other freshwater lakes, those who die in Lake Superior often stay there, permanently. Here's why. In warmer water, decomposition happens relatively quickly. Bacteria inside the body release gases that build pressure, causing the corpse to bloat and float to the surface. That's the tragic but natural process in most drowning cases. After a few days, bodies usually rise. But in Lake Superior, conditions are far more hostile, and paradoxically, far more preserving. The water temperature at the bottom hovers just above freezing year-round. Even in summer, the lake only warms at the very surface. Dive even a few dozen feet, and it quickly becomes icy again. Down at 530 feet, where the Fitzgerald came to rest, the water is cold enough to drastically slow decomposition. The bacteria that would normally break down a body can barely operate in that environment. No gas builds up, no bloating occurs. The bodies do not float. They stay exactly where they fell. The lake doesn't release the dead, not out of spite, but because it holds them in suspension, stuck in time, untouched by air, sunlight, or decay. So when searchers scoured the surface for days and found only fragments, no people, no signs of anyone having escaped, the scientific reality began to crystallize. They weren't lost, they were down there. But even understanding that didn't make it easier to accept. For the families, the wives, sons, brothers, and parents, grappling with that grim permanence was its own kind of storm. Closure seemed impossible without remains, without a final embrace, without a place to mourn beyond the abstract vastness of a lake. And yet, over time, something changed. The thinking evolved from recovering bodies to honoring them where they lay. The first dives to the wreck took place in the late 70s, shortly after the sinking. At first they were limited to submersible robots with primitive cameras, grainy black and white footage, and limited navigation. The images were eerie but inconclusive. No clear signs of the crew, no answers. Then in the 1980s, famed oceanographer Jean-Michel Cousteau arrived, the son of Jacques Cousteau, the most famous undersea explorer in history. He piloted a small submersible near the wreck, making the first manned visitation of the site. Again, they avoided entering the ship itself, out of respect, or perhaps fear of what they might find. And still no bodies were seen. But the dive renewed public interest and tension. Then came 1994. This time, the mission wasn't scientific, it was personal. A private team called Deep Quest Limited, led by Fred Shannon, dove repeatedly to the site. Unlike earlier expeditions, their gear was more advanced, their footage was clearer, their curiosity was sharper. On one of their 7 dives, they found what others before them hadn't, or hadn't spoken of: a human form, partially preserved by the lake's icy grip, lying face down in the sediment, still clothed, still wearing what appeared to be a damaged life jacket. It seemed this man had prepared to escape, or hoped to survive, if only for a moment longer. The footage appeared in a 1995 documentary, just a momentary glimpse, but it became one of the most controversial moments in the coverage of the Fitzgerald tragedy. For families, it wasn't closure, it was violation. They hadn't given permission. They never consented to see their loved ones displayed on screens for strangers to watch. Suddenly, an unwritten rule had been broken. This wasn't exploration anymore, it was intrusion. The backlash was immediate and furious. What for some was a breakthrough, felt to others like a desecration. Viewing the remains didn't answer questions, it reopened wounds, deep ones. Grief that had spent nearly 2 decades slowly settling was unearthed in high definition. That moment forced a reckoning. 2 forces clashed, the human drive to uncover the truth, and the quiet, sacred need to leave the past where it rests. And in this story, the second one, that same year, 1995, the families of the 29 crew members came together. They made a unanimous decision: this would be a grave, not a tourist destination, not a site, not an adventure site for divers, just a resting place. And so, the Fitzgerald became hallowed ground. Only one item was ever to be removed from the wreck: the ship's bell. Not because it was a relic, but because it was a voice. That bell, once used to strike the hour for the crew, would now toll once more, to honor each man who never came home. A replica would be lowered to the wreck in its place, etched with all 29 names. The original would find its home at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point. On July 4, 1995, amidst prayers and tears, the 200-pound bronze bell broke the surface for the final time. It was not just recovery, it was reckoning. They had all the bodies they needed to remember. They didn't need bones. They needed peace. The lake, silent once more, gave them what it could. When the bell was raised, it was more than bronze pulled from the deep, it was the weight of memory. For a brief moment, the surface of Lake Superior was not just water, but ceremony. Families stood on nearby vessels, watching through tears, as that cold-soaked artifact rose from the lake like a ghost finally allowed to speak. The names were not dredged from the dark, but carved in light, inscribed on a legacy no one wanted, and yet no one could forget. But even as the Fitzgerald's final chapter was being written on land, the story below remained fixed in silence. The wreck itself still lay 530 feet down, split in two, broken but surprisingly intact. The bow rested upright, preserved like a crypt. The stern had capsized, half buried in the lakebed. Between the two halves stretched a trail of twisted debris, ruptured steel, and the silent echoes of men who died before they could even cry out for help. There was a time when it seemed inevitable that more would be pulled from that watery grave. Technology surged forward with each passing year. Deep-sea submersibles were becoming faster, smaller, smarter. What started as curiosity for some turned into obsession for others. Why had the ship gone down so quickly? What happened in those final seconds? Could those answers still be inside that wreck? Speculation swirled like the eddies in Superior itself. Some believed the cargo hatch covers had failed, allowing thousands of gallons of freezing water to pour into the hold. Others thought the ship might have struck something, a shoal or an uncharted reef. A few suspected that a structural failure or design flaw had caused it to snap in two on the surface. And always, haunting every theory, was the question: could anyone have survived if help had arrived just minutes earlier? No autopsies, no survivors, no black box, only absence. It makes sense then, why some would want to descend again, to pry open the wreck, to illuminate the truth. But the line between discovery and disturbance had already been crossed once, and families refused to let it be crossed again. Not long after the 1994 dive showed the human remains, Michigan passed a law that made it illegal to publish or display images of human remains from a shipwreck without the family's consent. It was the first legislation of its kind, and it wasn't just about the Fitzgerald. It was about respect, dignity, and a shared understanding. Some secrets should rest with the dead. By 2006, Ontario, the province closest to the wreck site, declared the exact location a protected underwater cemetery. Not a historical site, not an archaeological zone, but a grave. One where million-dollar fines and strict penalties could be enforced. And recreational diving was effectively outlawed. If you weren't with an approved government or cultural institution, and often not even then, you weren't going to the bottom of that lake. Not there, not anymore. And so most people let it go. The story of the Edmund Fitzgerald moved from the headlines into the pages of books, the chords of folk songs, the walls of museums and hearts of communities all around the Great Lakes. People came to Whitefish Point, not to uncover, but to remember. They stood beside the salvaged bell, they read the names etched in metal, and they silently looked out over the waters, feeling the weight of what lay below. But not everyone was ready to stop asking questions. In 1995, two divers named Terence Teisel and Mike Z. completed what is still considered one of the most dangerous technical dives ever completed in North America. They used scuba gear, not submersibles, to plunge over 500 feet to the wreck of the Fitz. They had 6 minutes at the bottom, just 6. The rest would be hours of decompression, waiting for the nitrogen that had built up in their blood to safely dissipate. Any mistake could mean paralysis, even death. But they made it. They reached the wreck with their own eyes. They stood or hovered beside it, in awe. In that moment, the Fitzgerald was not myth or legend. It was metal, rust, wire, barnacle, and time. But even they didn't retrieve anything. They didn't crack it open to find crew members or take artifacts as souvenirs. They didn't need to. The sight alone was enough. They returned to the surface with what no one else had ever brought back, not bones or belongings, but experience, reverence, proof that even with breath in their lungs and light above them, the wreck itself imposed silence. It was a powerful message. The deeper we go, the more we must question why we descend at all. What are we looking for? Answers, justice, or something else, something human and intangible, closure. The Fitzgerald reminds us that at a certain point, truth can cost more than it gives, and that sometimes, mystery must be treated not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a monument to what we've lost. By the late 1990s, something had changed, not in the facts of the story, but in how people chose to carry them. The sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald was no longer an open investigation. It had become a kind of haunting, a weight passed down in whispers and snowfall, in the tolling of bells and the quiet faces of visitors at Whitefish Point. Yet even in death, the story had a way of breathing beneath the surface, and like the lake itself, it could shift without warning. That shift came not in the water, but in the air. Every detail about the final hours of the Fitzgerald had already been picked apart by experts and enthusiasts alike. The radio logs, the weather reports, the engineering specs. But the one question that refused to sink was also the one that provided the least comfort. Why did no one survive? It's a question that floats on the edge of every shipwreck, but with the Fitzgerald, it feels razor sharp. The ship sank without warning, no mayday call, no flare, just a calm voice on the radio saying, "We're holding our own," and then nothing. The Arthur M. Anderson, still nearby in the storm that night, never saw the Fitz go down. One radar sweep, she was there. The next she was gone, and that's what made it so brutal. Not just the speed, but the isolation. No witnesses, no alarms, just absence. The storm that engulfed Lake Superior that night was unforgiving, but the survival suits that may have saved lives, those hadn't been standard yet. Not in 1975. The Fitzgerald didn't carry them. The men on board wouldn't have lasted more than minutes in that cold water. Hypothermia would seize the body in less than 10. After that the lake does what it does best, silence and keep. If they'd only had that equipment, if the ship had been equipped with deeper hull sensors or reinforced hatch clamps or real-time rescue beacons, if. Regret is a cruel form of storytelling, and the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald is full of incomplete paragraphs, sentences that trail off without warning. One word more from the captain, 1 minute sooner on the radar. Could anything have changed? Maybe. But the deeper truth, the one that settles like silt in the belly of this story, is that when nature decides, there is no committee, no negotiation, no pause button. And Lake Superior had decided. Still, that decisiveness raised more questions. How could a 729-foot ship built to survive the worst of Great Lakes weather break apart so completely?
All what force could snap reinforced steel in half?
Was it design error, maintenance failure, or was the storm that night truly beyond comprehension? In the years that followed, two primary theories emerged. One, supported by the official Coast Guard investigation, claimed that faulty hatch covers allowed water to leak into the cargo hold. As the ship's load grew heavier, it descended lower in the swells, letting more waves crush over the deck, feeding the failure in a deadly loop. Eventually, the vessel simply couldn't stay afloat. The second theory, proposed by the National Transportation Safety Board, suggested the ship may have grounded on a shoal. Damaged from below, the Fitzgerald might have broken apart while still on the surface, its back snapping as the waves lifted one half higher than the other. But what both theories agree on is this: it happened fast, so fast, that no one had time to react, much less escape. That lack of reaction, the silence in the face of catastrophe, is what continues to disturb. For a big ship like the Fitz, even in crisis, you'd expect something. Mayday calls, lifeboats deployed, emergency flares, but there was none of that. And the lifeboats they later found weren't gently lowered into the water, they were ripped violently from their cradles, shattered on impact. Whatever happened, it was not gentle, it was not slow. And that's why, for many, the choice not to recover the bodies isn't just about depth or technology, it's about meaning, about what kind of death this really was. Because it's not just about where the men are, it's about how they are. They're not scattered across some debris field to be collected like pieces for an exhibit. They are intact in spirit, and perhaps, in some ways in form, held by a lake that stunned even seasoned divers with its power to preserve. After all, when the remains of that one crew member were accidentally filmed in 1994, there was still a recognizable human shape: coveralls, a life jacket, legs drawn up slightly, as though bracing for something that never stopped.
That image, brief but unforgettable, served as a reminder these were people, not artifacts, and for their families, that's what finally mattered. Not proving how they died, but remembering how they lived. Not pulling them to the surface, but letting them rest as they chose to work, together, on the water. The Fitzgerald, broken as she may be, still holds them. The lake keeps its secrets, but in doing so, it also keeps them safe. It's human nature to want resolution, a body to bury, a stone to touch, a truth to name. We search ruins, we dig through ashes, we dive to the dark, all in the hope that somewhere in the wreckage, we'll find not only the answer to what happened, but also some sense of peace. But the Edmund Fitzgerald resists that. It doesn't give closure, it offers weight, silence, all. It reminds us not everything can be recovered, and not every question deserves a final answer. Even its discovery on the lakebed brought more eerie reverence than clarity. The sonar scans showed the Fitzgerald in two massive pieces, separated by nearly 200 feet. The bow sat eerily upright on the silty bottom, like a cathedral sunken in shadow. The stern was overturned, lying on its roof, partially buried. In between, lifeless cargo, steel fragments, and the shape of a story forever paused. No expedition found signs of an explosion. No one reported fire, sabotage, or warning. The Fitzgerald hadn't disintegrated, it had torn in two, swallowed whole by gravity and cold. Like a mythological warning, whispered rather than shouted. Over time, other divers would confirm strange details, missing railings violently sheared away, hatches wrenched open or bent inward. Yet all of it pointed back not to conspiracy, but force. The sheer brutal force of nature. And through these expeditions, one truth loomed large. The crew hadn't simply vanished, they had remained. Not in the abstract, not in name alone, but literally inside the ship or buried around it. Resting in the freezing deep, where even decay had limits. Lake Superior doesn't behave like other lakes, or even most oceans. It's often referred to as an inland sea, for a reason. It creates its own weather systems. It houses shipwrecks in much the same way the Grand Canyon holds secrets, in layers, carved by time and unsolved silence. At such depths, visibility is nearly zero. In the winter months, currents are unpredictable at the bottom, pressures push in from all sides, and above all that weight and darkness lies one of the most tragic revered graves in maritime history. Yet no tombstones ever mark it on the surface. That's why recovering the bodies, even with modern technology, was never as simple as developing a sub, sending it down, and bringing something back. Bodies don't lift easily from twisted metal, limbs shift, bone detaches, cold preserves, but pressure breaks, and some remain trapped beneath what can't be moved without bringing the entire wreck apart. Even if you could retrieve the remains, what would there be to return? Skeletons wrapped in coveralls, human fragments held together by threads of fabric, and the lake's will. To disturb that, to lift remains from the grave after decades, became a line many refused to cross. Not because they couldn't, but because they had come to understand something deeper, that the Fitzgerald wasn't just lost, it was chosen as the final place by those who went down with her. It's easy to forget that ships are not just vessels for cargo, they are also tight-knit communities. 29 men had lived aboard that ship, shared coffee, laughed, swapped stories, and in their final moments, they were not alone. They were still together, weathering their last minutes side by side. There's a powerful, quiet form of dignity in that. So the story of the Fitzgerald stopped being one of recovery and became one of memorial. In 1995, when the original ship's bell was taken from the wreck and replaced with a replica engraved with the names of all 29 crew members, it wasn't just ceremony, it was a spiritual transaction. Something was given, and something was left. Balance, symbolism. A way to mourn without disturbing what lay below. The Fitzgerald is no longer a wreck in a traditional sense. It's a grave. It's protected not just by law, but by widespread consensus. Divers don't visit it anymore. Scientists don't probe it. Sons and daughters, wives and fathers, when they come to remember, they don't look down, they look out, across the water that took their loved ones, and now keeps them. The lake in its own way, became their coffin, and for many, that offers more peace than a grave on land ever could. Even the nickname of the lake, "She Never Gives Up Her Dead," has transformed. It's not said with fear anymore, but with a kind of mournful reverence. Lake Superior, once seen as a cruel force of nature, has become, in time, a guardian. To retrieve what was lost, would be to undo the resting place chosen by fate, by force, and ultimately accepted in grief. And so the question lingers, not why the bodies were never recovered, but whether they ever should be. If discovery means disturbing the dead, if closure comes at the cost of peace, if solving a mystery means opening a wound that's finally begun to scar over, is it worth it? For the families of the 29 men aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald, the answer was unanimous. Let them rest, let the ship remain silent, let the lake guard what it took, because in doing so, the Fitzgerald didn't just vanish, she became something greater, a warning, a monument, a legend tied to wind and wave. The men who went down on that ship didn't drift across the lake, they didn't wash ashore years later. They stayed where they fell, together, in the place they had worked, in the place they had trusted, and the world finally agreed to leave them be. Today, no one dives there. No new photos emerge, no crews plan new expeditions. Instead, poets write, historians document, and across small Michigan towns, families still gather every November near Whitefish Point, not to retrieve, but to remember. They touch the bell, they read the names, they play Gordon Lightfoot's song, and they gaze out at that vast cold water, where 29 souls found something final. Dignity, unity, and peace. The Edmund Fitzgerald, for all the tragedy that surrounds her, achieved a rare thing. She became sacred. And in the end, maybe that's the real answer why the bodies were never recovered, because they were never truly lost to begin with.